So how are you?
Good, how you doing?
Doing well.
Good.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Mia Carey. I'm an Education and Training Specialist for the Office of Human Rights. Today, we have a panel, the past, present, and future of Black resistance in the district and beyond. The panel is sponsored by the Office of Human Rights and the Mayor's Office on African American Affairs. So the panel format is as follows. We're going to have welcome remarks by Director Khan, and then I'll do a brief overview of the Black History Month theme as well as the panel topic. I'll introduce your panelists. This evening we have 5 discussion themes: being Black in America, resistance, self-care, safe spaces, and the future. Around 7 o'clock, we'll open it up for the audience. So if you have questions, give it a few minutes and I'll go over how to engage. We have a couple of announcements at the end, but we'll go ahead and hear from Director Khan.
All right, thank you, Mia. Being that we're an intimate group, I won't take too much time. And good evening, everybody. Hi, good to see you. I usually go off script, but today's been a long day, so I wanted to make some notes so that I won't miss it. So I'm really happy to be here to celebrate Black History Month with you all. I'm honored to have the opportunity to raise awareness around the historic and ongoing efforts of Black Americans to resist oppression and to achieve equality and justice. And so I'm not a DC native, but I'm a near native. I grew up here in the 80s and 90s. And as an immigrant of a country where it's been riddled with constant human rights, Civil Rights Act really resonated with me. The Civil Rights Movement really inspired me. And so I became sort of a social justice warrior, if you will. And so on my journey, the first stop was to go to law school. And so I thought I'd pursue justice through law school and taking on litigation and civil rights. And that got through some things, and I was able to help some folks for addressing gaps in race equality. But I also saw that legal battles really weren't the only tool in our arsenal for dealing with racial disparities and ongoing issues that we have in this country. What I learned is that it's not just about legal remedies, but it takes communities coming together, right, with the willingness to acknowledge the past wrongs, right, to understand the present issues and struggles and challenges, and to be conscious, right, to be conscious in our efforts to try to address all of these issues and to be inclusive, not just on paper, right? Not just because we have to, because the law requires us to do it, but because we know it's the right thing to do and to have our hearts in the way that we interact with all of our brothers and sisters in our communities. So to me, that's really important part of eradicating discrimination, part of achieving equality is to work together and have important conversations like we're gonna have today, right? To talk about these various themes that we have in terms of being Black in America, the resistance, right? Self-care is so important, and having safe spaces to have these conversations and to talk about what the future looks like with our collaboration and partnership in the various communities. So I'm deeply grateful to our esteemed panelists for being here tonight, for being giving their time and being generous with their stories and experiences that we're gonna learn from this evening. So, but on a note, I said I would keep it short, so I will keep my word, but I have to do a little bit of a plug. If you are facing discrimination, OHR is here. It's a free process. You don't need an attorney. We will process claims of discrimination. So, you know, we have, how many protected traits now? Do we know? 23, so most progressive in the country. And so let us know we're here. With that, I give you back to our esteemed Dr. Mia Carey and the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you.
So every year, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History picks a theme to kind of unify people. This year's theme is Black resistance. So African Americans have resisted historic and ongoing oppression in all forms, especially the racial terrorism of lynching, racial programs, and police killings since our arrival upon these shores. The theme goes on to say that Black people have sought ways to nurture and protect Black lives and for autonomy of their physical and intellectual bodies through armed resistance, voluntary immigration, nonviolence, education, literature, sports, media, and legislation and politics. Black-led institutions and affiliations have lobbied, litigated, and legislated, protested, and achieved success. So to celebrate that theme this year, we wanted to have an intergenerational panel to discuss the past, present, and future of Black resistance in the district and beyond. So I'm going to keep our bios brief just so we have more time. We have Addison Rose, who is the youth mayor, and she's also the president of the Jack and Jill Eastern Region Teen Board. We have Niciah Mujahid, who is the executive director of the Fair Budget Coalition, and she's also the founder and director of Herb and Temple. We have Ronald Moten, who is a co-founder of Don't Mute DC and also a co-founder of Peaceaholics.
And he's going to connect it.
And then we have Reverend Thomas Bowen, who is the director of the Mayor's Office of Religious Affairs and the interim director of the Mayor's Office on African American Affairs. So just to keep this going, I always like to start out with a couple of conversational agreements, especially when we get to the Q&A portion of the panel. So be present and open. You might hear something that is uncomfortable for you or new information. So receive this information and kind of let it settle on you. Respect silence and time. We'd like to hear questions clearly. This is a hybrid event for us. We'd like to hear all of the questions and the answers. If you have something, please speak from an I perspective so that you're not speaking for a group of people, and then listen actively. As I mentioned, this is a hybrid event. So if you're online, please keep your mic silenced. Raise your virtual hand when you have a question or type your answers into the chat. If you're here in the room with me, just wait until the question and answer portion. So with that said, we're gonna jump off with the first theme, the Black experience. For those who are online, this is Detroit-based artist Jonathan Harris standing next to his painting, Critical Race Theory, which came out in 2021. So your first question, what does it mean to be Black in America in the 21st century? And anybody can jump in at any time.
To be Black in America to me is just like being Black in America 400 years ago. Some things have changed, some things haven't changed. You know, a lot of things people say, oh, it's gotten better, it's gotten better, it's gotten better. They're still redlining. So as much money as we make in Washington, D.C., it's still hard for a Black person to get a house, to do things that somebody who doesn't have the same things that they have can get easily. And these are the same things I saw my grandparents go through 40 years ago. So when people say things have gotten better to me, I say, no, you cover it up. So they cover a lot of things up in America. And in fact, in America now, I feel safer going to Mexico and walking the streets at 3 o'clock in the morning than I do in walking the streets of Washington, D.C. But they'll tell you, and they'll put a travel alert out saying, don't go to Mexico, right? Why, I don't know. So my point is, like, some of the same things that my ancestors have had to go through, we're still going through it today. And it's so institutionalized now that a lot of people have been fooled to think that everything is all right. So they can't see it. And that's more dangerous than it was when people could see it.
For me, I think being Black in America means having to deal with white supremacy, having to deal with police brutality, whether it is yourself or someone you know. It means having to deal with gun violence. I think it means a lot of issues, like you said, it means a lot of issues that we've had to face for the last 400 years. But I also think it means resilience, power, and the demanding of respect. I think we, as people, have learned to build something from our sorrow, our heartache, build something beautiful, build a community full of love where we can cherish one another. And so I think it does mean a lot of issues and a lot of things we do have to deal with, but with that comes so much power. We're able to uplift one another, and whether it be artistically create or otherwise, we're able to do things that I feel like so many other people are not able to do. And so I think it's definitely a twofold situation of bad and definitely good.
I'll hop in. Something that you said inspired me to share a framework that I learned recently. I generally struggle with the term white supremacy because there's nothing supreme about whiteness, right? And so I've been introduced and invited to use white hegemony recently because that accurately describes what is happening, which is a power struggle and a power situation, right? White hegemony. So a hegemon is when you find, you know what I'm saying? Right. Oh, you know the Babs. Okay, so it's white. Yeah, so white hegemony, right? And so I want to invite us to using that term, all right? Because the flip side of white supremacy is Black inferiority. So every time we say white supremacy, that same coin is Black inferiority. We've been trained to say white supremacy so much. I want us to break free of the shackles of that. All right, so what does it mean to me to be Black in America in the 21st century? I think a large part of that for me is a shared consciousness and the necessity of a shared consciousness, right? We know, for instance, that we have brothers and sisters who we may identify as Black, and they're like, no. I actually am this over here or that over there, right? And so those of us who opt in and share the consciousness and identify as Blackness, that infers, implies, and necessitates a shared consciousness, right? With that, that means we also have a shared identity. We are able to lean into an understanding of a collective body and collective power and collectivism that we only have because of that shared consciousness. I think being Black in this century, in this place and context also means constantly navigating the spaces between privilege and safety and values and resistance, right? There's a lot of us who hold resistant ideologies and values, but we're navigating, am I going to be safe to imagine this world and create it? Am I going to give up my privilege of, being upwardly mobile, right, to be resistant? And so I think that's always a constant tension for us. And that shows up in the collective body, but also in our individual bodies. And so that's worth naming. And I'm gonna pass to you.
Well, for me to be Black in the 21st century, unfortunately, almost means the same as being Black in the 20th century. I can't say the 19th century because that would diminish the impact that enslavement had on us. But there are a lot of parallels. Seemingly, we're having to fight for the same things over and over again. We're fighting for voting rights, something that we thought that we had won. Someone said that we won't get all that we pay for. We'll pay for all that we get. I liken it also to I believe it was Sophia in The Color Purple. All my life I've had to fight. To be Black in the 21st century is to fight and to continually fight each and every day that you wake up.
I wanna add some joy and love on top of that, though, because it also means dancing. It also means having babies. It also means sitting on the porch. And so it's not all struggle. It's a lot of struggle, but like within that, whole lot of beauty, whole lot of love, whole lot of narrative shifting and meaning shifting, and all those things.
And I will say, like what she's saying, we do benefit from the work of our ancestors.
Yeah.
I know a lot of people who sacrifice for us to have the voice that we have, and they died broke. They died wondering if it was worth all the fight that they did. And some of them died knowing that we would take the torch and run with it. So that's the other piece of the puzzle. Like, a lot of people put us in a position and made great sacrifices for us. So that's the story of America. Like she said, some of us have to choose whether we are willing to make that sacrifice. And also understand that this institution that we are fighting also sees our strengths, and they attack our strengths on a regular basis as well.
So how has racism affected you?
I can go first on that one. I didn't realize until I left the area that I grew up in a segregated neighborhood. And so all major cities are still very much segregated, and we're not talking about it enough. And so that had an impact on me, but there's some positives too, right? Because when I went to college, I was one of the only Black girls. I went to PWI. I was one of the only Black girls who had Black teachers and Black professionals around me all the time. And there were students who were like, I've never had a Black teacher until I got to university. I'm like, oh, PG County, oh, we got teachers. And so, you know, just living within segregation, knowing that we also live within racialized capitalism. And so all of our assets and our class status is really closely linked to our race. And I think also, yeah, just that last piece about the fact that race is in a lot of ways a social class has impacted everything in my life.
Well, for me, I grew up in Ohio. I grew up south. Elyria outside of Cleveland, next to Overland and Lorraine. My town was a stop on the Underground Railroad. We weren't taught that in school. I learned that when I went to college. But everything was about race. And every now and then to catch myself, my habits are because of race. Growing up, when we would go from Ohio to South Carolina and North Carolina, we thought it was the game that whoever was driving were able to go there with the least amount of stops. Granddad would have us to get out the car only in certain places. It was 2 years later, right, that I realized that the reason why he makes me so little stops because there's only certain places he could go. Use the restroom, to get gas, because he understood that there's a reason he left South Carolina in the first place, and he didn't want to have to go through that exercise. So I had to catch myself when I started driving the family south. I had a friend I was sweet on, who went with us, and she said she had to use the restroom. I said, well, just wait, because I wanted to be able to make as few stops as possible. And that's when I realized that my behavior was based upon my grandfather's behavior, which was based upon the time that he grew up in. So a lot of the things that I do today, I have to be careful about because it's based upon a certain mindset and experience.
Okay. For me, I am freshly 18 years old. And so I haven't had as much experience as my fellow panelists, but I would say a lot of my experiences come from the classrooms in which I grew up in. I've went to majority private schools my entire life, and I currently attend a boarding school in Alexandria, Virginia. And so with that comes a lot of hidden racism. It's not very much, I wouldn't say it's outspoken, but I definitely feel it a lot of times. For instance, I play varsity tennis. Tennis isn't really a sport, at least in that area, that a lot of people of color play. And so I'm the only Black girl on the team. And a lot of times the girls try to act like I don't deserve my spot on the team. I mean, it's a very small group. It's not as big as a football team. It's about 12 of us. So it's definitely highly selective. And I would say the girls try to act like I don't deserve my spot on the team a lot of times, which is something that I just proved through my talents. And I think that's definitely something we as people of color always have to do. I would say we prove through our education, our knowledge, our talents, that we deserve a seat at the table. We don't just get it handed to us because of privilege, whether it be our parents or otherwise. I mean, I also had a teacher who gave me what I would say a lower grade in comparison to my fellow counterparts in the classroom because of how heavy the topic I chose to talk about was in an essay of mine that I wrote. And so I would say many of my experiences come from being in the classroom, being in predominantly white schools for a majority of my life. So I guess we'll see if that'll change as I head off to college. But between that and whether it be like restaurants and having to wait to be seated because it seems like I might not be as privileged as those around me, it's definitely something that has affected me.
I would say the way racism affected me early on in my life, it made it hard for me not to have hatred in my heart because I saw the things that white people and white institutions were doing to me, my ancestors. My cousin is Malcolm X. So I know that behind the scenes, there were white people illustrating that whole thing. So just to know that, you know, because I study history and things, that every Black leader who has stood up for my people was assassinated directly or indirectly by white people, right? To know my history of how we got here through the transatlantic slave trade and everything else that's happened to us that we've done in America ourselves without the infrastructure of a racist society, they have destroyed it. So it's kind of hard to love. Somebody say, love America, love this, love that. How do you love somebody that continuously oppresses you? You feel what I'm saying? So that's something that you fight with every day. And, you know, I remember walking with Reverend Belville up by St. Elizabeth, because I studied under a lot of civil rights leaders who work with King. And it was a lot of people walking around who had mental health issues. And he told me, he said, Ron, why do you think a lot of these people are walking around like this? Yeah. And I said, I don't know. He said, because when you go against what you believe, it will drive you crazy. And a lot of people in our communities are forced to go against what they know is right. Yep. And also become, I don't want to say cowards, but they're scared to stand up to this racism that we see because of the consequences that they normally see our ancestors go through. So that fight that you have, sometimes it makes it hard for you to look at everybody else who doesn't look like you and say, you know what, there's some good people there. But you know what, it also makes it hard to look at people who look like you. That's true. Right? Yeah, I agree. Because we've been taught to be afraid of each other. We carry so much trauma. You know, like you said, we've seen so many freedom fighters, so many truth tellers, so many liberators be killed, become political prisoners. They still in cages, in boxes today, and we carry that trauma with us. Even when we don't know we're carrying it, right? We have visceral reactions to things. It's in our DNA, we're passing to our children. And so like even on a DNA coding level, racism is weathering us. And I've seen it with me. Like we had an organization that people still try to duplicate to this day in DC. And people know that I didn't do anything. And they still destroyed something that sent 160 children to college, that brokered 40 truces in this city, right? And they'll let the media and everybody tear you up, and your name is cleared, and nobody come and say, you know what, we apologize, right? And they do that to us all the time, and they often use our own people. Yes. And I remember, like, far as the racist institutions, when we were doing the work, and there were people who couldn't do nothing that we do, right? And these same people would be behind the scenes trying to figure out how they can destroy what we were doing because we were really helping our people. So we go through this all the time. People of color in this country, when you start making progress and you start uplifting your people, most of the time without the help of the structure, they try to destroy it. So it's like, I'll take credit. Well, that's the other thing. They study you, they study you, they study us, they study the work that we do, and then they try to sell it back to us. They discredit us, bring other people in, take our stuff, and then try to sell it back to us and take credit for it. So these are all the things, as far as the racism that we see, that if you don't have thick skin, it would drive you crazy, or make you just don't want to be a part of none of this stuff. So I can honestly see how a lot of people lose their minds, you know, in this country, because you're forced to go against what you know is right, or you're forced to stop fighting. So both of those things will drive a strong person crazy, or you know, make you lose your mind. So you see a lot of people, they be like, I wonder what happened to him or her. How could she, or how could, most of the time it's things like this that cause us to go there. And it's due to the racist system that we face every single day in America. And I'm gonna close with this. A lot of the Black politicians, like, it's always been a crime for them to give Black people equity, to help Black people with equity, not no, you know, little dog and pony show. But whenever it was about somebody really empowering people of color with equity, they always criminalized, always. And that's the things that, like, people like me, how do I deal with it and stay stable and don't go off and don't tear shit up? Oh, I'm sorry. Don't tear things up. But like, really, those are the things right there with me, far as the racism.
Some of the things that Ron was saying in terms of our genius and that how it's monetized, you know, now that, you know, we learned a way when taxis wouldn't pick us up, we had a hat. Now it's called Uber and Lyft. And when people needed a place to stay cheaply, we put a pallet on the floor. Now there's Airbnb. Growing up, you had to buy your clothes on layaway. You got looked down upon. But now it's Afterpay and Klarna, right? Some of the same things that we grew up.
Numbers.
Running the numbers. Now it's a legal lottery.
Everything.
We can't sell it.
Everything.
We can't get a dispensary.
Man, what?
And I'm gonna say this. I'm gonna close this. Like, we say that we the most progressive city, but I wrote an op-ed before they passed the legislation to make marijuana legal, and I told them, don't rush it. Let's make sure that Black people are able to sell it as well, and let's make sure we educate young Black people that the weed is not for them. The progressives who say they want to help us were just interested in making money.
Yep.
So they passed the bill. All the white people got the dispensaries, except a couple of people who the face of a dispensary who don't even own it for real, right? And nobody who was selling drugs illegally can sell it legally, but other people getting rich off of it. Same way in DC. When we grew up in DC, you had Black cab drivers. They bought houses and sent their children through college because they owned their cab companies. We had Black street vendors. Same thing, getting wealthy off of it. Every single thing that we've done in DC as Black people, that we got wealthy off of it, they criminalized it, put a moratorium on it, and other people who not from our country came here, and then they were the ones that got it. And we sitting by looking and wondering why our children in the street doing what they doing.
There's no mic to drop.
I was thinking the same thing. I was
I feel like you need some water or something.
Thank you.
So for those in the audience, there was something Addison mentioned that I want to uplift. When I normally do racial equity trainings, I always start out with something called a community builder. I ask the audience or participants when the first time they realized race was a factor in society. So I have people sit on that for a minute, and I'll share the story that I always share with you just so you get an idea. My mother is a fair-skinned woman, naturally blonde. I take my color, my hair, everything from my father. So when my mother would come to school, I used to be teased, oh, your mother is white. This was second grade.
Right.
I didn't understand. Like, my father was as dark as night. My grandmother was fair-skinned. My mother was the only one whose hair remained blonde. But that experience sat with me. And the idea of colorism really didn't hit me until I went to college. I went to Howard, and I met Jamaicans for the first time, or Africans for the first time. So colorism has always played a role in my experience. It might be something small that happened to you when you were young, but think back to the earliest time when you can remember. I always tell people of color, you remember racism because it's something that happened to you. If you are a white person, it is something that you witnessed or you heard, but it wasn't something that you experienced. So I was trying to look at the name, but there's a process of becoming racialized. Black people go through the process a lot sooner than white people, but I would caution you to kind of look into how to become racialized or experience race for the first time. If you're interested, I can share resources later, but just kind of look at that and kind of sit on how that has shaped your experience. And that leads me into this last question. What do you want others or non-Black people to know about your experiences and reality as a person, a Black person in the 21st century?
I would say that failure is not an option with me, and that nobody can stop us from doing anything we want to do. A lot of times, I'll talk about the Don't Mute DC movement, for instance. So many people in Washington, DC before that happened, everybody was saying it's over for Black people. It's over. This might as well move, whatever, right? The smallest of victories give people hope.
Yes.
And from that, we've seen policy change in this city, equity policy. We've seen young activists be developed and see the power that they have as young people, just like with Martin Luther King. I didn't know until maybe 2000, and I want to say 6, that children ended segregation. Like, most of us don't know that when King went to prison, it was the young people who organized with Reverend Belville and went into 16th Street Baptist Church and then filled the prisons up and ran Bull Connor out of town. Like, most of us don't know that. So, like, just knowing the power that we have and what we can do in America, and how everybody around the world is watching us, and know the responsibility that we still have. And also being Black in America, when I travel, I know that one of the good things about the internet is that we're connected to the world now. We're connected to our family, our relatives all around the world. So we have the opportunity now to do something that we never have done before. So it's up to us to organize, not just with Black people, but with good people, wherever they may exist, because there's a lot of people who understand that everything that's going on in the world right now is not sustainable. So we don't change the way and the things that we're doing right now, none of this stuff is going to be going on. Like it's going to be worse than what people even think. And the other thing I would say, being Black in America, is that I really understand the power of our music through the movies that I've done, the movies I studied with in the 60s, but also the way that our enemy has put poison in the music because they know the power that it has. So we have to get back into creating platforms as Black people. And that's one of the things I realized, Black in America, to make sure our young people are able to use the spirit that we once had and the music and all these things that come from our ancestors to finish a fight that has not been finished yet.
I kind of want to build off of that point. I think I have seen a lot of how, this fight can be hard. I mean, you want to give up a lot of times. It feels like it's not getting anywhere. And I think that's why it is so important for youth to speak up and out now. I mean, if we wait, then imagine the state of the world, the state that the world and our country will be in years from now. And so I think that's why it is so important that we continue to fight against the way that our society is trying to suppress us. For instance, going back to this point of school, this past Monday, I had the opportunity to bring in a dear friend of mine, Yolanda King, the only grandchild of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Currently. And I have become friends with her through our activism. I met her at a civil disobedience rally in front of the White House where we risked arrest to advocate for voter suppression. And so I think bringing her into that space, once again, a predominantly white space, I got a lot of eye rolls and a lot of head turns where she was advocating for gun laws, stricter gun laws and stuff like that. And they're all like, a lot of them are Southerners, so they're just like, but I think it's making that necessary noise in spaces that may not think they need it. I think our voices are so powerful as a collective, but even when it's not in a collective, when we're on our own, I think it's so important to continue the fight that may feel so hard and may feel so dreadful, like it has no final destination. And so that's what I try to preach to the group of people, to my generation. But I think we have amazing people to look up to who are helping guide us and teach us through the amazing things that they're able to do and the movements that they're able to start.
Okay. Well, that's a hard question because I don't think it's my responsibility to teach folk who are not Black. I think that it's a lot of denial that takes place. We witness what I believe is Custer's last stand, that the browning of our country caused an alarm to sound for many folk. And I think that the way forward is to people understand that we're not going back. We'll fight at each and every turn. And so it's a reckoning. And I think people need to also recognize their privilege and understand. I like what former governor of Texas, Ann Richards, was saying about a presidential candidate at the time. I won't say his name, Bush. And he said that he was born on third base and swears he hit a home run.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of people who look at other folk and question why they have not been able to achieve at their level, not understanding and not realizing and recognizing that as a mentor brought me to DC, Mary Edelman says, in this country, children have unequal childhoods. And we expect them, all children in our country, to achieve at the same level. Miss Rose is just talking about being on a tennis team as if her classmates had never heard about Thea Gibson, Arthur Ashe, never heard of two sisters, what are the names? Serena and Venus, Sloane Kaufman, and Naomi, and yet and still she had to justify her existence on a tennis team, on a sport that our people have excelled at the highest level.
I also struggle with this question, and that's why I wanted to go last, because I'm not interested in what other people know about us, right? I'm not interested. It's not my job. I don't care. You couldn't pay us enough to educate all the people about all the things, right? But what I'm interested in is us being self-referential, right? I need us to know all the things that Ron said. I need us to know we're brilliant. I need us to know how talented we are. I need us to know that, you know, how powerful we are. I need us to know that our local struggles are inherently global. I need us to know that when we liberate Black people here, we liberate Palestine. I need us to know that when Black women ain't right, everybody Black ain't right, right? I need us to know that our power, the world knows it. But if we don't know that, it don't matter what anybody else knows. I'm not really interested in what other people know about us. I'm interested in what we know about us. And we have to be interested in what we know about us first, what our kids know about us, what we see when we see each other, what we're telling ourselves of our self-talk, what we're doing in our communities. I think that's so much more important. And also, like, for us to know resistance is crucial. The fight ain't over. It can't be over. And also that our biggest strength is our spirit. We are a collectively strong spiritual people. Everybody knows it, but we don't know it, right? And so I think the task at hand is for us to figure out what we know about ourselves.
So we're gonna go to the next theme, which is resistance. So I have a couple of questions, but we won't have to go through all of them. You can pick and choose if you wanna answer one. So the first question is, how does the theme Black resistance resonate with you? The second question is, what connections can be made between earlier Black freedom movements and current protests? And then the third question is, boycott, sit-ins, and marches characterize the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. Colin Kaepernick started kneeling during the national anthem in 2016. Neither of these methods were deemed acceptable. Is there such thing as acceptable resistance, as there is a Black woman kneeling in front of the police in San Jose in May of 2020?
I think one of the common themes in years gone by and now, Ron has already touched on, and that is the involvement of young people. We saw it in the 60s, and we see it now making its way in the form of Black Lives Matter, being and joining with Ron and others on Don't Mute DC. Could it be that the folk who have nothing to lose but a lot to gain are the ones putting themselves and their bodies, you know, out there in the streets and at the forefront? So I think that we have to recognize the power of young people, in addition to the power of Black women and young Black women. But that's a common strand. They just don't get the mic as much and the notoriety sometimes. But the people who are working behind the scenes, day in and day out. When you look at the march from Selma to Montgomery, there are people who weren't there on Bloody Sunday, but they were there when the cameras, you know, came in. Those are the people that we kind of clue in on. But the young people, I think, is the engine that drives all social movements.
So I'm gonna jump in really quick. You mentioned not naming, you don't recognize Black women. So does anybody know when the earliest sit-in of the civil rights movement happened and where it happened?
I was gonna say, I can't tell you that, but what I can tell you is my work, even with Peaceaholics, why I was so successful, is studying the work that the women did during the movements. And one of the things, like being in the living room of Amelia Morton Robinson, taking children to be Annie Lee Cooper, and all those women who were strong, and basically King came and worked out of their houses, right? And what I found out was that a lot of times men would listen to women, right? And it was the women who basically stopped us from being looked at as animals when the guys wanted to retaliate. So Bevel would take the young ladies and get them to tell the guys, hey, y'all can't retaliate. If you retaliate, that's what's going to be on TV. And because they had the strength and the women were smart enough to motivate the guys in the street not to retaliate, that's how the young people ended segregation. So when I started doing my work in the community, I knew that I could go get the females to get the guys to listen. So sometimes the guys in the hood would listen, but sometimes they would listen to a woman naturally because most of them are raised by single parent households. So I knew the power that our sisters had naturally, right? And fast forward, now a lot of our women have been taught, right, not to be women. When I say not to be women, they're getting away from their strength, right? Because I know I wouldn't be where I'm at without my grandmother who raised me and other strong women in my family when sometimes men were going through problems and might came back later. So like the women have been so instrumental in kings' lives, and men who are normally successful understand that dynamic. And if you study the history of it, you will know throughout time that's been the case. Whether the women were given their props or not, we know that without them, that mostly everything in history is impossible. So, I mean, those are things that I learned from, like, I'm talking about being in the living room with the women who were great, Amelia, you know, and all these women died broke. The real freedom fight, they died broke. Some of them died with a broken heart because I never forget when Amelia was being pushed across Bloody Sunday for the 50th anniversary. And all I was thinking in my head, she's broke, and they getting a photo op with her. Yeah. And, you know, when they leave after this big celebration, she gonna be in the same situation that she was in. I had to give her whole life to our people. So I just want to say, you know, I have a special place in my heart for our sisters because I know like what they've done for us. And I also know the power of making sure they with you side by side with you in strategy and everything that you do is the balance that you have to have. So
for every one time you mention Dr. King, you need to mention Ella Baker 5 times.
Right. And
here in DC, Nanny Ellen Burroughs was a mentor to Dr. King. So there are all these folk that we have to go back and study and give credit where credit is due.
I want to address the third question, but also raise some of the points you made. Part of what you're signaling to is the importance and the necessity of collective care.
Right.
Right. And so there have been so many instances where we see Black women giving collective care. We see Black women say, well, come have this meeting in my house and I'm gonna cook these plates. And we're gonna keep your kids over here if you don't have, you know, childcare, and we're gonna make sure you have a ride home. If you don't have no clothes, we're gonna make sure you have that too. And no one's giving that back to Black women. That's one. We also see the same thing with political prisoners. So there are so many people who have become political prisoners through the civil rights movement, through the Black liberation movement. And we say, oh, good luck. We ain't putting no money on their books. We ain't writing no letters. We're not calling them. We're not saying their names, right? That's that same lack of communal care. And so when we're thinking about resistance, we have to think about community care as a form of resistance because the system don't want us to take care of each other. That's the point. That's the whole kill. That's how capitalism works. They want us working so hard, we can't call and check on each other. They want us working so hard, I can't keep your kids for you because I got to take this second job. Good luck. I can't make no place for this meeting because I got to clock in over here. I got to pay this person. I got to rob Peter to pay Paul. We can't do no collective care. And so doing that is an act of resistance in itself. But then that also brings me to the fact that even that is not acceptable. The question of, is there acceptable resistance begs the question of what are we resisting? When we answer that truthfully, we're resisting the state. We're resisting the District of Columbia's government. We are resisting a system that has this big, pretty ass library down here and the library is falling apart in Congress Heights, right? We are resisting our employers. We are resisting code switching. We are sometimes resisting things that tell us, well, it's legal to do this and not legal to do this and going against our morals and what we know to be true and making ourselves sick over it. We're dying, right? And so we have to be very real about what we're resisting. And until we can keep it a buck like that, and say we're resisting capitalism. I'm resisting having to pay Pepco to live. I'm resisting having to pay $1,600 for a 1-bedroom when housing is a human right. When we say we're resisting all of that, then we know the resistance can't be acceptable. How is that? How could it be acceptable to say, well, actually, you know, this electoral system we have ain't quite right. And there's this over preponderance of cameras on the south side, traffic cameras on the south side, not in Northwest. Like all of those things are the things we resist. You gotta resist the tax policy in here. Right? None of that's
I'm gonna say something. I gotta say this. So we've had cars running our front yard at least 8 times over the last 2 years. It was a camera on Alabama Avenue where we live at, right? And when they put the camera there, the car stopped speeding. I mean, they've knocked our fence over, ran in our yard. Today, another car ran through the lamppost. They will not put the camera back, but they got all these trick cameras all over the city where nobody's speeding just to get a ticket and get money.
But then the trick cameras, they also have enough cameras that I was talking to a sister recently. We're working on a project on community control of surveillance. Because there's mad cameras in DC and don't nobody know who looking at them. Who watching you right now? Where's the data going? We don't know. And so working on this campaign, we were working with sex workers who have been over surveilled, right? And one of the things we learned is that one of the sisters, her brother was killed, and they were able to follow all these trick cameras his whole last day. They saw him go here, go in this store, run over here, pick up his kids. They saw everything, right? Because there's so many cameras. Remember they was giving out Ring cameras and they was like, sign up, there's cameras everywhere, right? But then she was sexually assaulted while she was working, a sex worker. They couldn't find the footage. They couldn't find it. Right? We're resisting that. That can't be acceptable.
Well, I kind of want to talk about the second point on the connection between earlier Black freedom movements and today. I think we have lived through the current modern day civil rights movement as we see or as we saw marches and rallies and demonstrations against George Floyd and police brutality. I think it's important that we emphasize that I think a lot of the youth are leading all of these movements. Youth were at the forefront of, movements when it came to gun violence, guns in the classrooms, how they're killing innocent students who are going to school, going to a building to learn. And so I think there's so many connections we can make between today and years ago, but I think it's unfortunate that a lot of the connections we are making is that our people are still suffering in many different ways. I feel like there were protests of the 1960s that were extremely effective that, for instance, brought the demise of state-supported racism in the South. We have the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955. We have the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And so I think those things really set the groundwork for us having the courage to take a hold of our country, take a hold of our voice and really act upon it. I think that youth have done a lot, but youth need to do a lot more. They need to be more courageous and have more pride in the voice that we have and in the power that we have. I think a lot of times we're scared. We don't really know what the other end of the stick will look like, how it will backfire potentially on us. But I think we need to look to our past and look to the people that came before us as they led a lot of those great movements and how we have the potential to do even more today, especially through things like social media, where we're able to connect with people all around the world.
And I want to piggyback on what you said about that. One of the things I want to say is Frederick Douglass said it best. Power concedes to nothing. Yep. It never has, it never will. So when you start talking about these movements and will it be accepted, anything that's right that fights against the systems that we're talking about would never be accepted. But in the end, we always win. I mean, Kaepernick is like a hero now. Yeah. But everybody, including Black people, try to turn him down, shame him, make him get up off their knee.
Because there's no such thing as acceptable resistance.
Exactly. And I hope that emboldens us to say, well, if they're going to act like I'm showing my ass if I'm just kneeling, might as well actually show my ass, right? Because they won't criminalize you anyway.
Right.
They shot the king. People be acting like Martin Luther King is the palatable, option versus Malcolm X. They shot them both.
They shot them both. And with King, the same people who said they love him, he can only speak in 2 or 3 churches before he passed.
Yep.
So it's a lonely thing being courageous because most people are not willing to sacrifice. But some of us are born with it in our blood, and some of us are born to lead. And I think it's up to us to get behind people and protect people who had the courage and are born to lead. And I think that's what people where the pain comes from. Because when you need people the most, when you go through things as a leader, most of the people who you help are not there. And you will find that it's people who sometimes don't even look like you who will be there to help you. And I never forget being with people who work with King, and they was like, Ron, never become a racist. I said, why would you say that? I can't be a racist anyway. But they were saying, because there are always going to be a few good people who don't look like you, who are going to help you behind the scenes in the war that we fight. So if you become a racist, you will never get to know those people, even though it might be a few of them who are willing to sacrifice to the level that you are. So those are some of the things that I learned with that. But power concedes to nothing. But when we come together and we fight and we let them know and we show our force, they can see. But they go back in the room and plan though. That's the thing. Like they back up, they go in the room and then they plan and they come back harder.
Because they got the resources, the time, the leisure. We working 2-3 jobs.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying? They got the time, the plans, the grandfathers. I'm gonna call my aunt, give her $10,000, towards this game, And so in some ways, because the machine has been perfected, it's always working. White hegemony always working. You sleep, that joint's still doing its thing. And it's on code. They don't get off code at all. That lets you know how much fight we gotta have and how much resistance, acceptable or not, we gotta do. Because that machine running.
And I think it's crazy that a lot of times we're the ones deemed dangerous, but I think history has proven everything, majority of which we have done, the movements we have started and worked through have all been peaceful, or at least the leaders of those movements have all advocated for peaceful protests, peaceful sit-ins, peaceful boycotts, walkouts. Today we see these schools have students who are walking out because they feel like they aren't being upheld to the highest standards. There's issues within their own systems. And so I think it's amazing to see the power that we have. And I think it's important to emphasize that it always seems to be advocated as something done peacefully, but we're deemed as the dangerous ones or the bad guys.
So there's something that I want to uplift that you said about MLK at the end of his life. He wasn't popular. There's a book by Jeanne Theo Harris, A More Beautiful and Terrible History, the Uses and Misuses of Civil Rights History. So in this book, she talks about how MLK and Rosa Parks are these Macy's Day balloons. They're bigger than life, but you forget who they really were. There's another book by Charles Cobb called This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed, where he's actually talking about how MLK had guns in his house. They weren't his, but he felt like it was better to surround himself with people who had guns than it was to be without it. So I think a lot of times when we talk about the civil rights movement, we also have to realize that the history that we're taught is not actually the history that happened. So earlier I asked y'all when the earliest sit-in was. It was right here in DC, 1944, Polly Murray. She took students from Howard University, went to the Little Palace cafeteria, and that's where they staged the first sit-in. So there's a lot of history in DC that I'm sure we're not taught, but I encourage you all to go out and kind of do your own research. I've been a big advocate for that over the last couple of years in particular. So if there are resources that you need, I have a bibliography. I've shared it within the office, things like that. So with that said, I want to talk about self-care because that's another thing that's been on my mind. And I want, skipping ahead, y'all. I want y'all to look at this photo. This is Rosa Parks practicing yoga at an event. So in the 1960s, Black women understood the power of self-care and of taking care of our bodies. So they viewed controlling their health as a corrective to the failures of the white patriarchal medical system and began promoting self-care as a political act. This is where you get Audre Lorde. Caring for myself is not self-preservation, it's a political act. So I love showing colored photos of the civil rights movement. That's another tactic for you to think that, oh, this happened so long ago. It didn't. So if you Google civil rights, color civil rights photos, there are a lot. The March on Washington, MLK. We had a presentation on MLK earlier for our staff meeting this month. I showed MLK playing pool. How many of y'all knew he played pool federally for 20 years? So there are all these things. So when we think about the work that we do, how stressful it is, and I can admit that when I first started doing this work a couple of years ago, I was angry. I hated everybody. but I had to learn how to care for myself. So I read Audre Lorde's A Burst of Light. So this is where my question comes from. It's like, how do you practice radical self-care? It's not going to get a massage. It's not going to get your hair done or your nails done. But like, how do you resist the system and practice that self-care? What do you need to continue to do the work that you're doing?
I would say with me, I've learned to love myself more because what I found, if you don't love yourself, nobody else is going to love you, right? And you have to also, like, helping people is addictive. And I know when I was doing the interruption work, my days were at least 16 hours every day. I'm talking about from 2006 to 2011, every single day, pretty much. And it got to the point where I couldn't even have a healthy relationship because I might meet a woman, she praising the work I do. Then once she realized I don't have no time for her, it's like, well, why don't you go mess with the children? You know, I'm seriously. So you have to learn how to do balance. Like it's hard to have balance and be successful. And that's the challenge of a lot of people who do community work and help people in their communities. And I'm gonna say this, I have no problem with building wealth. I wish I would have started a lot earlier because we have been taught not to have heaven on earth. Like our people have been taught like it's something wrong with you wanting to do well and leave something behind for your children and their children and their children. And I wish I would have really understood that a lot earlier in life than over the last couple of years. So I think self-care is, and like I said, I watched all the civil rights leaders who work with King Die Broke. And I watched how people didn't really do nothing for them. I'm talking about the real ones, the ones who didn't go cash in, the ones that trained people like me. You know what I'm saying? Like they were doing it till they died. They were having children come in their houses at the age of, Amelia died at what, 101 or 2 or something like that. She was still traveling until she was 100 years old, going around teaching. This is what they did. And I want to do the same thing, but it's with balance. I refuse to die and not leave my children nothing. I refuse to die and not be able to say how I enjoy my life as well. And I think when you helping your community, that's something that I teach people. Do get a nonprofit and a for-profit. Because the nonprofit is a white person's hustle. We can't do the same things they do in a nonprofit. When we do it, it's criminals, right? And I tell people in this city, and I stop with this, you know, they'll tell you that Trump is bad. But I watch all the white nonprofits grow in World War I. They grow, they become big, right? They sell their property in World War I. They come to war, they buy the property. Then they start getting the contracts east of the river, pushing the small nonprofits out of business, right? And then tell you come work for them. So what's the difference between them and Amazon? Isn't that the same model?
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is I study all this stuff. And I tell people, don't get caught up on parties. Don't get caught up on none of that stuff. That's where they get us at. Get caught up on what's in your best interest. And that's how you deal with your health. That's how you deal with wealth. That's how you deal with equality and everything. Other than that, we pawns in the game. So, and if you're not healthy and you're not leaving your children left behind, you really ain't doing nothing for the fight, the struggle, because you teach them how to fight and they ain't got no resource to fight with. It's kind of hard.
I want to push a little bit deeper into the concept of like wellness and health and how we're passing that on. And name that part of the reason I started my little small Easter River nonprofit is to center healing work in the movement. If we do all this work to get free, we at every protest, we fighting, we doing all the things. Let's say we dismantle the systems, we get to the other side, we haven't healed. Guess what we're gonna do? Bring the same stuff. Right. We're gonna show up with the same patriarchal attitudes. We're gonna show up with the same colorism. We're gonna show up with the same white hegemony. We're going to show up with the same self-hatred. We're going to show up with the same overworking tendencies. We're going to show up with the same overcompensating that we do, right? And so part of the way that I have integrated my own self-care, but also invite others to build collective and community care is by knowing that the healing work and the care work is part of the resistance, is part of the liberation, right? Part of what we're resisting is a push that says Black people got to work yourself to death and don't get nothing for it. What does it look like to take a nap and say, you know, I'm not producing anything. I'm gonna rest. I'm gonna dance instead. I'm gonna find joy. At this meeting where we're gathering to build this strategy and we building this protest or whatever it is, we're gonna dance first. right? We're gonna ring shout first. We're gonna pray together first. We're gonna eat well first. We're gonna feed each other. Then we're gonna talk about the struggle, right? But I think also adding on to that, we have to know that self-care can't happen in a vacuum. So if you don't have folks who are supporting you in your self-care, you can't care for yourself, right? And if you're not supporting the care of others, you also are not caring for yourself, because our wellness is intertwined. Like, so how my neighbor is doing affects how I'm doing. They house falling apart, what does it do to my house? Right? If they kids, you know, if they're not getting enough attention and they acting up, how my kids gonna act? They're gonna do the same thing, right? And so reframing the self-care is integral to collective care and integral to resistance is super important. And I think it helps us to emphasize that we can't bypass the care. We can't bypass the rest. We can't bypass fixing our diets. We can't bypass getting off big pharma. We can't bypass returning to ancestrally driven and culturally competent diets. We can't skip that part. We can't bypass the birth work. We can't bypass figuring out how we're gonna catch our babies again. We can't bypass figuring out, like, you know, how we're gonna overcome this food desert, right? That is integral to the work. But again, we can't do it in isolation at all.
I want to go back and say something about the previous question and then address this one, because we can't become revisionists in our history. We understand that there are people that Dr. King, yes, he faced criticism all the time. And he talked about that in some of his speeches. And in fact, it were Black Baptist preachers that criticized him the most,
yep,
to the extent that he had to leave the National Baptist Convention and form Progressive National Baptist Convention, which is still headquartered here in Washington, D.C. They actually had a physical fight at the National Baptist Convention, which led to someone falling to their death. And we have to say that so that people know that when they're trying to engage themselves in movements today, that criticism is to be expected, even from people who look like you, who you thought like you along those lines. Admittingly, this self-care is where I need help the most, right? But I'm learning that more. So I value now the time that my family and I will get a place rented in the Outer Banks. It's nice, y'all, to be there, you know, on the water. And let's be clear, when we started doing that, there are people who said we were acting like people who didn't like us.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And who do we think
Yep.
that we were?
Yeah.
So now, you know, I will lean into it. Yes, we rent a big home at the Outer Banks, and we go there. Yes, I'll be at Martha's Vineyard in August. And yes, my family will rent another home in Ohio next month. And that's the time that I value the most. Being with my great nieces, bringing my goddaughters with me, and pouring into them some of the things that poured into me, but teaching them also to expect certain things in life. And so I love the question because it's a challenge. I don't believe that we always have to answer questions with something thought-provoking. That's not the reality, but it's trying to learn how to do better at self-care. That's not a word I used 5 years ago. Yeah. All right. That's something new, and I'm glad for it. And I'm glad I have a friend who left on Sunday and decided she's gonna live in Mexico for 3 months. And run her business.
We deserve it.
I just came from
3
Mexico.
months.
Listen,
Yeah.
it's a whole Black village there in
Baby,
Mexico. I just left
Black
there.
Columbus.
Yeah.
She herself how to speak Spanish, and she's gonna be there for 3 months. And I'm like, how can I be down, right? But I
There's so
can't
much
be down
peace and
if you
unity
put,
away from
put
this.
a value where it should be, and not on the things where society says you should put it.
Also, I don't want to bypass the part that you said about like what you're doing is teaching your grandnieces, right? I have such a good diet. My kids eat so well, but it's because I decided like I'm gonna take care of myself. I'm gonna eat these plants. I'm gonna take an extra long lunch break. I'm only using glass containers. Like I'm gonna be super crunchy and lean into that so my kids don't have to get older and they say, damn, my diet messed up. I've been eating a lot of oodles and noodles, right? Like, you know, because that's where I grew up. I grew up oodles and noodles, peanut butter jelly girl. And so, you know, I think that the self-care, it ripples out. It's like a snowball thing. When people see you doing it, they like, dang, you living like that. It feels good. You deserve to feel good.
Yes.
I deserve to feel good too. Y'all taking trips. I want to take a trip. You know what I'm saying? You got leisure. I want leisure, right? We got to normalize that.
For me, I feel like self-care is understanding that, I mean, we as people of color, but specifically women, we carry such a burden when it comes to feeling like we need to carry the weight of the world on our shoulders. We need to be doing everything at one time instead of just breathing and just taking a beat and calming down and going with the flow. I think it's okay to do so. And I think a lot of times we feel like we need to be going 1,000 miles per hour when we don't. And when we do take a second to step back and breathe, we're able to think about our mental health, think about how we're really feeling, reflect upon that, and think about what we need to be doing for ourselves to get better. We can't help everyone else around us if we don't help ourselves first. And so by doing that, I think for me, I'm able to understand that I can't say yes to everything as much as I may want to. I can't, and that means missing out on super amazing opportunities sometimes. But if that's what I need for myself to be the best version of me, for those around me, to do the work that I'm doing, to be an activist, to be a leader for those that are looking towards me for guidance, then I have to do what I have to do, whether that means getting an extra hour of sleep, eating those good meals full of nutrients, and just taking time to be with myself and enjoy the presence of myself, my thoughts, and my knowledge.
One of the things that it reminded me of there's a saying that, like, you know, I'm my ancestors' wildest dreams, and often it's talking about like economic success. Like, I'm out here getting this bag, I'm making this, I'm making that. And really, like, your ancestor might have dreamt of a nap, a sabbatical, a rest, some wellness. And so I think that framing is important too.
I just want to uplift the fact that everybody is trying to go to Mexico. I've been 3 times, twice solo, and it's, I don't know, it's the last place I can remember being happy. So the fact that Black people can go to Mexico and like find peace in that, I think it's a beautiful thing. So we do have a question that came through. How do you deal with internal conflict within the movement, such as cancel culture and disagreements that lead to division?
Well, I think, first of all, our people don't do well enough with uplifting one another. I think way too often we're the ones tearing each other down. I mean, we're talking about these institutions that are trying to break us down and aren't necessarily supporting us, and we're not even supporting each other. And I think we see that through colorism. I was having a conversation with a friend of mine the other day who is African, and we were just talking about the struggles that people of color, Black people, go through in America. But he was saying that it's hard for him to love, you know, Black Americans when for so long people pointed out, dang, like, you're dark, and people thought it was such an issue to be African. But now, I mean, we looking at Thames, Burna Boy, loving their music, loving Afro, this idea of Afrofuturism and Afro beats and what that looks like. And so, you know, my point is that I feel like in order for us to deal with these issues of cancel culture and whatever else, we need to be loving on one another and uplifting one another. And if there is something that we don't agree with, you help them, you give them tips, you uplift them so they can be better. Because if you're successful, if you're eating, then I'm happy and I'm eating.
Word. I think the cancel culture and like the internal strife points to the fact that we don't have a code that we're operating on within the movement. And so we've seen people like sell each other out, like you gonna call them and tell them, like, we could have handled that in the house, right? But we don't have a code. But again, white hegemony got a code, capitalism got a code, they on code, and we're not. And because we don't have a code, we're calling each other out, we're not dealing with our hurts well. I had an elder tell me recently, like, yo, whatever we go through in the struggle, like whatever differences we might have between us, the space between you and I and our disagreement will never be as big as the space between us and whiteness. So whatever it is we got going on over here, we got to fix it over here and be committed to not calling out, but calling in. Be committed to educating each other. Be committed to saying, I'm going to hold on to you because at the end of the day, you're still kin. And while you're learning through this, I'm going to learn through it with you. And while we're struggling through this, we're going to struggle with it together. We're going to create a process. We're going to call in if we need mediation. We'll do that. We'll call our elders if we need to. Call your mama. I'll call my mama. We can all pull up. You know what I'm saying? But because we are not, that is part of the resistance in and of itself. And sometimes we're so focused outward that we're not looking and saying, well, how are we operating with each other? And can we get that right first? Right. But we gotta stop that. But I just got canceled and called out a couple weeks ago. So I don't even
it is what it is.
You know, for me, I try to be honest with myself and recognize that I have not always been the person I'm trying to be right now.
Yes.
So I allow some room for growth. You know, it was Biden pushed President Obama on the issue of marriage equality. They were, you know, playing the polls for the most part. And so I think that, you know, you got to walk with certain people.
Yeah.
You have to expose them to certain things. But more importantly, I just recognize the fact that I've not always been who I am. I grew up in the Baptist church. I'm still in the Baptist church. And so my progressive views don't get me invited to certain places. Folk find out that I do same-sex weddings, right? They don't just clutch the pearls, they throw them to the floor.
Yes.
Right? But it's been a process. And I stand up each and every turn for that God is a God of love, and God's love is greater than my love, or God's not greater than me. If God, we know that we have made a God in our own image, when that same God hates the people we hate and only love the people that we love. But it's been a process for me, and I think that some people have to walk with them a little bit longer as they evolve and come to an understanding. And I don't need everyone to agree with me. But I hold out for a certain kind of respect that people are due in life. But I just try to think of the fact that I've grown over time.
So we had a question come through that kind of leads us through like the next theme, where we're going to talk about it briefly, and that is this idea of safe spaces. So how many of y'all have seen the movie Beloved? Do y'all remember the scene where they're in the woods? And that's a hush harbor. That was the original safe space for us. So this is a color painting of a hush harbor, unknown date and artist, but during slavery, enslaved persons gathered in secret to practice their religious traditions, which were then replaced by the Black church, emancipation celebrations, HBCU homecomings, barbershops, hair salons. Rarely have these spaces ever existed for the opposition of diversity or upholding racial superiority. So we all know about the importance of safe spaces, but the question that was asked was like, how do you set boundaries to protect your own well-being? So a lot of times we hear people saying, oh, we're going to invite this person to the cookout. So how do you set your boundaries?
Because you feel like you have to, you know, that's what you're saying. Well, I think it goes back to this idea of putting ourselves first, putting yourself first, putting that wall up, that guard up, and you can do it respectfully no. You know what I'm saying? There's ways that you can talk to people that isn't degrading, that isn't hurtful. And I think that's something that a lot of us need to think about, that there's ways that we can put ourselves first in a positive way. There's ways we can give constructive criticism or criticism in general that isn't meant to hurt and tear other people down. So I think when it comes to setting those walls and barriers, when it comes to, you know, saying things, pushing other people out in a respectful way, it's all in the way you say things. And I think it's definitely all in your tone.
I think to veggie back on that, a lot of it goes back to the principles behind the boundaries. So if we have clear principles that say, this is what makes this a safe space, right? We can point back to that principle and say, it's not personal. This has nothing to do with me. It has nothing to do with you. I might have a funky attitude. You might have a funky attitude, but that's not what this is about. The principle says that in order for this space to be safe, we've agreed to this. This happens in a space. This doesn't happen in a space, right? Whether it's, okay, we use this tone in this space, we don't. These people are welcome in a space, they're not. These identities are in this space, they're not. These type of activities are in this space, they're not. If we can point that back to a principle, it kind of does that work of having principal boundaries and not personal boundaries, not vengeful boundaries, not emotional boundaries. Sometimes like we're emotional and we're reacting, especially in the movement, like this is emotional stuff, right? We should be upset about these things. And so sometimes we're operating from that place and not from a place that says, well, what are the principles around this space and the container that we're trying to create and why?
You have to stand for something, as was stated, or you're going to fall for everything. But this image behind us is a wonderful image where the folk were able to gather outside the earshot and the vision of those who would oppress them. But that's the founding also of the church where I serve, Shiloh Baptist Church, was founded in 1863 by 21 former slaves who came from Fredericksburg, Virginia to DC, opened up a congregation near where the Mayflower is right now. When they first opened their doors, by law, they had to have a white person present. That place was burned down. And they had to move. They moved twice to get to where they are now at 9th and P. And we still are trying to embrace the notion of having a safe space. Because after Barack Obama came to Easter service, we received phone calls and threats. We know that in DC, Asbury United Methodist has been attacked, and Metropolitan AME has been attacked. So that now one of the offices that I lead work with our congregations to get them security grants from the federal government to make sure that their houses of worship are protected and they are safe. So it's funny, once again, we're talking about the safe space. And today we're trying to make safe spaces at some of the same institutions, the threats that Howard University receive. And Spelman and other schools. And so we have to be realistic about the space that we are. And that goes hand in hand with having, being principled. Mother Emanuel welcomed the individual into that space with no idea what would happen there on that site. So history tells us that we have to be real about this notion of boundaries and what a safe space actually is and whether it is safe.
So our last question, I had questions, but the only thing I can ask now is where do we go from here? I mean, so what lessons do we take? And what issues do you think have been kind of overlooked and need to be addressed going forward? So we've addressed healthcare and housing and policing and jobs, but like, what's the one issue that you can think of that hasn't been addressed yet? And like, what kind of legacy do you want to leave the next generation?
What kind of legacy, the next generation, that's Miss Rose, right? You know, I think about this all the time, which is why I post on social media. I'm trying to leave a footprint intentionally on Facebook and Instagram, so that my relatives can come behind and say, hey, that was our cousin, our uncle. These are the things that he was involved in. I want Black folk to believe that anything and everything is possible. We need to get back to dreaming again and envisioning ourselves again and painting. That's why Black Panther Wakanda speaks to people, right? And Afrofuturism, because it takes you out of where you are and it presents a sort of Black or African utopia. Right. And we need that because you can dream it and think it, right? Then you can achieve it. So the whole idea of dreaming, which for so many people is a luxury, right? And it should not be. Yeah. But be able to think of yourself. And I actually got this because, you know, I'm from Moja. My grandparents' house had a picture of Jesus, and it had a picture of Robert Kennedy and John Kennedy and Martin King. And so those quotes are my first things that I remember memorizing. Some people see things as they are, and that's why. And other folks see things as they aren't, so why not? And we have to get to that place of being able to see a piece of paper in a puddle, but seeing a yacht, right? And envisioning that. So getting folk to dream a different and see things differently is what I'm hoping to empower people to do.
Thank you for that. Welcoming and receiving that. This past weekend, I facilitated a workshop on Black dreams and Black imagination and how important that is for resistance and how the prophetic imagination is tied to liberation work, right? And how a lot of what the machine is doing is taking us out of being able to dream new worlds and imagine our way out of these systems, right? And it puts us in a position where dreaming is a luxury, right? Even down to like the foods and the environment and the pollution, right? It's doing something to us so that we can't imagine because that's so powerful. So thank you for that. I will add on that love. We're not talking about the love enough, right? How are we loving each other? What does it feel like between us? What do we want the new world when we get there? We want to feel like that's important. I want to feel like love, right? And so bringing a love ethic and a love politic into resistance is super important. I also think the spiritual aspect and bringing our God consciousness into the space is so important. And we have to go back to a place where we're not afraid to do that. Something happened to us that made us stop doing that. We have experienced some trauma that has made us divorce our spiritual selves from our political selves. And it's a lie. Right. I would say the love ethic and the love politic, and that's just really loving each other and letting that be the motivation. Not no get back, not no I'm mad, not none of that, but I love you so much that I want leisure for you. I love you so much, I want to go diet for you. I love you so much, I want decommodification of your housing for you. This is how much I love you, right? But also I have principles and an ethic that comes from a source that is not here and a primary relationship that can help shape my principles and can override all the disagreements between us, all the fitra and all the things between us is so important. But that goes back to love too. All goes back to love.
I think everything we've emphasized here today is so important for my generation and those to come to never forget. But I definitely want to emphasize that we must never forget our history in order to do something about our future. I think we look back at past generations. I mean, we're using the inventions of our people of the past. We're listening to the music that they created. We're looking at the art that they were able to bestow upon us. And so I think it's important that we never forget to look into our history to help guide our future. And with that, I want to say that we can never rest. I mean, it's hard, the fight is long, but we can never rest until true equality and justice is served in every aspect of life. I mean, when we see an injustice, it is our duty to do something about it and not wait for the next person to do it. There's this theory in psychology that, you know, there's a group of people, there's the man dying in the middle, and everyone's just expecting someone else to do something about it. So no one ever calls the police. And hours later, I mean, the man is dead because everyone thought that someone had done it. But you have to say, you go and do it. You have to hold some accountability towards other people as well as yourself to go out and make the change that you want to see.
Sure. So to kind of wrap us up, I'm sure y'all have all heard Redemption Song. I listened to that song for months on end while I was writing my dissertation. It was so powerful that I tattooed the lyrics on my arm. What I didn't know at that time was the 2 lines, emancipate yourself from mental slavery, none but ourselves can free our minds, was spoken by Marcus Garvey in 1934 in a speech in Nova Scotia. So when we think about Black history, when we think about Black resistance, when we think about where we go forward, I would just encourage everyone to take the opportunity to learn or relearn Black history for yourself, internalize that, and then figure out where you want to go forward. Everybody's journey, everybody isn't going to be an activist, but there are things that you can do every day to kind of unlearn past harms and oppressions and kind of create a better future. And so with that said, while you're here, and I want to thank our panelists tonight for joining us. For the last couple of months, or year really, the Office of Human Rights has been working on this inclusive language guide. We partnered with the Mayor's Office on Racial Equity, and today we unveiled it for the first time. Congratulations. So for those of you who are in the room, we have copies of this guide so you can learn about all of the ways that we can create a safe and inclusive environment in our our workspaces, in our communities, in our own homes. So if you are online, I think my colleague Tyler Cargill dropped that into the chat. But if you have questions, my contact information is on it. At some point we'll give training, but I do just want to say that inclusive language is a first step in kind of unlearning past harm. So read it, digest it, post it up, but please enjoy it while you can. That does conclude today's panel. Again, thank you to all of our panelists. I'm so very thankful.
Yes. Amazing.